Anyone else?
Over there.
Sorry, yes, right.
To what degree do you think that making personal altruistic choices is more or less important than affecting political change that would perhaps change the circumstances of the people that you're from?
Okay, so this is a question about the relative importance of making personal contributions rather than contributing to political change. Julia, since you've been fielding quite a lot of questions, maybe we'll go to you, Alexander, if you'd like to comment on this, and then we can perhaps I'll get a comment from the others after.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is something I've thought a considerable amount about, and it's something that to some extent I work on as part of my work at GiveWell, trying to think through, what kinds of differences can philanthropic dollars make when they're trying to achieve policy change. I mean, I think that there's one sense in which the answer is just going to be sort of a purely empirical one, which is, you might have some opportunities to try and influence policy in your life. You guys are Princeton students. You might have access to certain kinds of opportunities or circles. And so, I don't think there's necessarily a one-size-fits-all answer about the likely returns of those activities. Certainly, there's cases where I think that those kinds of opportunities are the best ones one might be able to take, whether with dollars or with career choices. And those are obviously going to be fairly different calculations. I don't agree that this is something where there's a sort of deontological argument that, you just need to privilege political exercise over sort of personal spending or personal efforts. The basic story I would tell here is just that, people like Julia, who are giving sort of really considerable amounts of their personal wealth or income to people living in the developing world or in particularly poor countries, I think, serve as a sort of obvious constituency for various kinds of political change, and that by being out there and publicly working towards these kinds of efforts, I find it hard to believe that were there not, a lot more Julias and Jeffs running around, the discourse on foreign aid and other aspects of U.S. policy that really affect poor people wouldn't be sort of in a much better situation. So I sort of deny that there's a strict dichotomy, but I do think there's a really good question for any individual about exactly what the trade-offs are and where the returns lie. And I don't think it's obvious that one or the other always wins.
Zell, you mentioned coming from a family that has a leftist political background. Did you think when you decided to give money away that maybe you would give it to some organization that's working for political change rather than donating it to what's a more conventionally thought of as a charity?
I guess the argument can be made. I don't know if I was on the mic when I was telling you about my father believed he was angry at the money I gave away and said that I'd made a fool of myself. And he believed that private philanthropy blunts the edge of revolutionary fervor. So, and that, that's something that Lenin was against private philanthropy, Marx was against private philanthropy. They were terrified by the thought that by ameliorists who could make things better, and then you wouldn't have a revolution.
Right, but the revolution didn't make things all that much better
Revolution didn't either. I think that the best argument against, I'm not saying that you shouldn't support progressive causes, but the best argument against it is that the time, energy, and money that you're putting into one cause is being matched by the same amount being put into the opposite cause, and that $100 billion supposedly that's spent in every election cycle on getting people elected would be enough to lift Africa out of poverty.
Did you want to comment on that, Julie?
I do think there may be cases where, certainly there are a lot of cases where different political sides are just butting heads and it's just sort of a waste of money, but there may be cases where policy could just be done better in a way that no one is especially opposed to. And I think part of the emphasis that we're seeing now on doing charitable interventions better, having them be more effective, more transparent, more measurable, and being able to tell what's happening, I think that's a really positive thing in general, and I'm hoping that that will, go forth to some public policy things as well.
So that we're actually getting assessments of whether you get good value for your dollars in public policy. And I think GiveWell are starting to look at that. Is that right, Alexander?
Yeah, I mean, mostly we're still thinking from the perspective of people who are giving sort of private dollars And the question is sort of like, how can you influence policy using those dollars in a way that's productive and meaningful, as opposed to sort of trying to say, with a government as the sort of recipient of our research, how could government policies improve, and then ourselves sort of trying to get them to practice that. So I guess I would say like we're less think tank, more sort of like philanthropic advisor. There certainly are a lot of groups out there now who are trying to think about the question, how could government policy be sort of more transparent, more effective, more evidence-based, and really trying to sort of advocate to the government directly on that. It's just not where we see our comparative advantage.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, we're over here.
What if instead of donating now, I were to invest that money?
So the question was, what about if instead of donating now, you invested that money? You suggested investing it in a mutual fund. In Zell's case, maybe he could invest it himself, since he's got a very successful record of doing that, and therefore had more to give away some 20 years down the track, say.
But I guess there are a number of arguments. You obviously know the arguments for it, which is the accumulation of capital over the years will be considerable. But one argument against it is that you'll lose the philanthropic impulse. Another argument against it is that indulging that philanthropic impulse is actually creating habits of mind in you that will cause you to be even more profitable, successful in the future, so your net giveaway in the end will be greater. A third argument is that exigent circumstances exist now that are they're tremendously pressing, and they have to be met immediately. But the main argument, I think, is that people don't do it.
You think it becomes an excuse for not giving it all?
The rationalization, yeah.
Julian, you
I think also, personally, I want to keep in the habit of giving. I don't want to risk, getting to age 60 and deciding that, changing my mind. But I also think that, so through places like GiveWell, I think the philanthropic scene is changing, and there is more evidence-based giving, or giving to charities that can demonstrate their impact. I think that's really important, and I think that's something I want to support and want to encourage, and donation, I think, is the best way to do that. So I'm hoping that by the time I'm 60, charities will be better, and it will be easier to find better charities, which is some people's reason for wanting to wait. But I also think that they're not as likely to improve if we're not giving them that incentive, which is that they see there are donations out there for charities that are proving their impact.
And I think the other thing that... Sorry, Alexander, yeah.
I agree with Julia on that last point especially, but I just want to add, I do think there's a really clear trajectory in global health towards sort of cheap, cost-effective things being taken up and taken care of, basically. 20 years ago, you could have paid to get more kids really basic, cheap childhood vaccines, and now the vast majority of those are done, or at least the cheapest ones. And so, this is in line with Zell's third point, but the world keeps getting better in ways that I think make it harder and harder to use money to make a positive impact. And my guess is that it's getting better at a rate that's faster than whatever investment return you're going to make. Maybe Zell is an exception, but for most of us who are sort of going to buy diversified index funds, you're not going to beat, I think, the pace of sort of positive change in the world. And so the prior, I think, should be you're going to give sooner rather than later. Julia's point about giving continuously and helping the community grow, I think, is an important one. But
Okay, so in other words, you're saying you can actually make a bigger impact now than you might be able to make in 20 years. And I'd also add that there may be some kind of other kind of investment payoff in that if you contribute to make a family better off now, their children perhaps are better nourished, therefore their brains develop better, or perhaps they get education which they wouldn't have got before, and they may therefore be able to do great things to boost the economy of their country, which they would not have done if you'd not given now.
There's also,
we're going to have to wind up soon, but
just a quick point that the U.S. tax code makes it extraordinarily more advantageous to give before you die than in testamentary donations. If you have money, it makes no sense to wait and give people the money in your will when you can set up charitable trusts now.
Definitely better to give while you're still alive, and also, in fact, if you're giving large amounts, to give each year, right? Because there is actually a limit to how much you can deduct, and if you were thinking, I won't give anything for 20 years, but then I'll give it all, it's more tax effective to give some of it each year. We are going to have to wind up, so I'm sure say thank you to Alexander and thank you to our guests here as well.